Hello and welcome everybody to the final session of the Women's Budget Group Early Career Network annual conference, which has been a great day. There's been so many good papers and presentations and discussions. I've really enjoyed it. And we're absolutely delighted for our final session to have with us Tithi Bhattacharya, who is going to give our keynote presentation. Tithi is a professor of South Asian history and the director of global studies at Purdue University. She's the author of the Centennials of Culture, Class, Educational and the Colonial Intellectual in Bengal, and the editor of Social Reproduction Theory, Remapping Class, Recentering Oppression. Her most recent co-authored book includes the very popular Feminism for the 99%, a manifesto, which I know many of you have read and enjoyed because people have been talking about how much they're looking forward to hearing her speak. Her work's been published in the Journal of Asian Studies, South Asia Research, Electronic Intifada, Jacobin, Salon, The Nation, The New Left Review. And she's on the editorial board of Studies on Asia and Spectre. And she's going to be closing the day by looking at social reproduction in the context of COVID-19. So Tithi, we are very much looking forward to hearing you. Thank you so much for speaking to us today.
Thank you so much, Marianne, for inviting me, and thank you to all of you listening in and participating in the Women's Budget Group conference. I've been talking about this group on social media, and you know that if you live in the UK or even if you don't, this is definitely a policy group, a feminist group that is really worth paying attention to. And I was surprised and delighted by how many of my social media friends and people who follow actually came in and said, we already do. It was wonderful. And it's a testimony to the work that the Women's Budget Group do. So thank you. It's an absolute privilege and delight to be here with you. It is, however, a very challenging time, as many of you know, and probably many of you have experienced firsthand going through this pandemic, and particularly the government's response to the pandemic, which is how the pandemic comes home to us. You know, it has been a nail-biting few weeks in the United States, where I now live. And I'm happy that the outcome of the elections will probably mean better outcome for how the pandemic is dealt with in this country, but many challenges stand before us. I just want to touch upon a few things about the pandemic in particular, but how that relates to women, and especially women of color in this current moment. And so I'm going to start with the present, but then I'm going to try to reflect back upon the past that brought us to this present. What were these communities and social groups like? What were their lives like before the pandemic hit? And does this past have anything to do with the way the pandemic affected particular social groups? And so I'm going to start briefly with the present. This pandemic and the government's response to it, and by this I mean all governments around the world really, with a few notable exceptions, offers a clear and tragic illustration of the idea at the heart of social reproduction theory, that life-making always bows to the requirements of profit-making. Capitalism's ability to produce its own lifeblood, which is profit, utterly depends upon the daily production of working people. That means it depends upon life-making processes that it does not fully and immediately control. At the same time, the logic of accumulation and profit-making requires that capitalism keeps as low as possible the wages and taxes that support the production and maintenance of life. This is the major contradiction at the heart of this system. It degrades and undervalues precisely what and who makes real social wealth. Nurses and other workers in hospitals and healthcare, agricultural laborers, workers in food factories, supermarket employees and delivery drivers, waste collectors, teachers, child carers, elderly carers. These are the racialized, feminized workers that capitalism humiliates and stigmatizes every day with low wages and often dangerous working conditions. Yet, the current pandemic makes clear that our society simply cannot survive without them, hence the discovery, as I say in my title, of governments of essential work. Society also cannot survive with pharmaceuticals competing for profits that exploit our right to stay alive. And it is apparent that the invisible hand of the market will not make and run a planet-wide health infrastructure, which the current pandemic shows that humanity urgently needs. And we'll see what happens to the Pfizer-created vaccine and how it is distributed to the most needy. The health crisis is thus forcing capital to temporarily focus on life and life-making work, such as healthcare, social care, food production, and distribution. As we all know, during the various lockdowns in various countries, governments worldwide produced a list of essential workers. And if you look through the list, you will see topping the charts precisely those workers that, as I said, capitalism had previously humiliated, such as nurses, domestic workers, agricultural workers, and so on. It was unsurprising for us and those of you listening in that no stockbroker made the list of essential workers. And this focus that the states were temporarily forced to make on life making should, after the pandemic passes, we should demand that this focus remain even after this crisis, so that health, education, and other life-making activities or social reproduction activities are decommodified and made accessible to all. So I'm going to share a few slides to talk about exactly what I mean and how we got here to this place where social reproduction activities, which is the precondition to all work, which is the precondition to all labor, how that life-making labor becomes devalued structurally within our current social arrangement. So let me see if I can do this easily. Okay. Okay, I hope you can see. So as we all know, and you know, feminist groups have emphasized from time immemorial that care work in the home is mostly performed by women. We also know that professions which encompass or embody the spirit of care work, such as teaching, nursing, home care, also have larger number of women in these professions. And so we must talk about the recreation and maintenance of life rather than simply as unwaged care work in the home. These services and infrastructures, schools, hospitals, public transport, are vital to what I call life making or the production of people. I'm not sure if you can see, not just for reproducing lives, but for building capacities and attributes that are essential to the human condition. So capitalism, however, constantly pits people making with profit making. So people making work, which is about life, such as educating, guiding, providing relief, support, and comfort, are constantly devalued in favor of the making of things or profit. So as you know, that even during school strikes, when teachers have gone on strike, historically, as well as more recently in the United States, I traveled up and down the United States to talk to striking teachers in 2018. And one of the things that was stunning in the way teachers organized the strike is, yes, the schools were closed, but in the United States, as you probably know, children get a free meal for breakfast and lunch at the public school or government schools. Since this is the UK, I don't mean public schools the way it is meant in the UK. So the government provides free meals to all public school children in the United States. So when teachers went on strike, the schools would close, which would mean that the children would be cut off from their daily meals. And for some families, and in many parts of the United States, this would be one of the most stable meals that the child got in the entire day. So what was stunning to see was teachers organized with local community groups and churches to actually provide meals for the children, even when they were on strike. So we're talking about this spirit of life making infused not just in wage work and unwaged work, but also such work combining the spheres of waged and unwaged labor. This kind of work is impossible to fully quantify. So as we know, academics, as well as nurses and teachers, often spend time with their patients or school or students for hours that they don't get paid for. Teachers, particularly in the United States, spend money out of their own pockets to stock the classrooms because the public school education is so severely underfunded in this country. And so this is primarily because I argue that the end product, if you like, is a person, not a thing, who requires a totality of care rather than simply the making of widgets. So performance is especially difficult to measure in gendered jobs such as health, education, and childcare. This is another reason why you will see, as feminist economists have shown, that men tend to go into work sectors where the work is easier to quantify than in other sectors where it is more difficult to quantify. Under capitalism, however, none of this is important as far as metrics are concerned. Wealth is measured in dead things, not in living people and their welfare. So it's more important to produce widgets, to produce iPhones. Those are far more profitable goods that come out of the production process than people who are produced, if you like, by these severely committed and severely underfunded life-making activities. So women's paid work in the global context, 70% of health and social workforce are women in the care sector, compared to 41% in all employment sectors. Nurses and midwives often provide care in communities where no other health professional exists. But we have to include alongside of this unpaid work, because all work that makes paid work possible in the first place happens in the home. From cooking and cleaning to fetching water and firewood or taking care of children and the elderly, women carry out at least 2.5 times more unpaid household and care work than men. So I just want us to bear in mind that this unpaid work, mostly carried out by women and gender non-conforming people around the globe, actually makes possible for the conditions for all work, not just care work, not just iPhone making, but all work. Neoliberal policies since the 1970s globally shifted resources from public to the private sector and reduced the benefits to recipients, affecting the lives of clients and workers alike. For 40 years, neoliberalism systematically corroded institutions that the working class needs for its life-making. So hospitals and public parks and schools were all taken off the list of priorities, and production for commodities were and the market was given full control over these life-making activities. Food and fuel subsidies were removed, public distribution systems dismantled, hospitals and schools privatized, even public parks were sold off. Increasingly then, the burden of care, which was even somewhat taken up by welfare sector and welfare states before, increasingly moved it to the family unit and simultaneously commodified care. So we have two sort of axes developing here. One is that since the 1970s, because healthcare, education, and so on were privatized, more and more of these tasks moved into homes, and women's unwaged labor burden increased. But on the other hand, these works were also commodified. So for instance, we saw more and more of this work becoming waged, but in a racialized manner, so that a few privileged white women in the global north could actually take advantage of this, while the care work in their homes and families were mostly performed by immigrant women from the global south. So if we look at neoliberal production and we look at paid care work, we see that paid care work was throughout the period of neoliberalism and austerity, de-skilled, broken down into meaningless, discrete, and commodifiable parts, and came under increasing managerial scrutiny. So, I'm looking at how much public education in schools where suddenly teachers were responsible. Well, in the United States anyway, even their jobs were in jeopardy if certain metrics of grades and so on were not met in their schools. Similarly, in the home, we had unpaid care work made more onerous, and people and women had less time to do it because they were holding down 2, 3, 4 jobs, and more effort was needed because the unpaid care work just became more increased in effort because there were no hospitals or public infrastructure to help with that. And this meant also throughout the 1970s, the emphasis on production of things, the emphasis on accumulation, the prioritization of the market ruling over all other considerations meant that communities were left with poisoned air, water, and food resources. And of course, most of these communities were in the global south, or when in the global north, they were communities of color. A recent New York Times report shows that 70%, and this is how high it is, 70% of pollutant industries are sited in neighborhoods of color in the United States. So if we are talking about people being made in this assembly line, we are talking about capitalism looking at people making in this sense, which creates complete burnout and depression of people working in the life-making sector, jeopardizing the health and welfare of entire communities. And nurses are told that there's a set amount of time that you can stand next to a bed, and that will be managed in how much time you spend with each patient. So this kind of micromanaging of life-making activities and care-making activities, putting the work of people making into an assembly line has led to complete burnout of people working in this care sector. As I said, in the United States, at least, where healthcare is so unbelievably privatized, nurses are supposed to be recording their time in these electronic health record systems, which determine how long they can actually remain in the bedside of their patients. In the classroom, high stakes testing is tied to teachers' assessments and to their jobs. And of course, we are looking at public services being dismantled, such as transport, social housing, and environmental protection all out. So all of the resources for people making and life making are being commodified and treated as if these workers and women are making things rather than people. So instead of thriving communities and life throughout the neoliberal period, what we have seen is a tyranny of things. So the production for production's sake, accumulation, we are constantly told about how the GDP of each country is increasing and so on, at the expense of the planet and at the expense of life. So I'm going to stop there and talk about how we can think about, there we go. How we ought to think about the political dimensions of care, such that we look at care work as a political response to neoliberal austerity. So we have seen, for instance, during the pandemic, the immensely political response from our nurses and our care workers. One of the most beautiful demonstrations that I saw was our nurses standing in front of the White House with the shoes, carrying the shoes of their fallen comrades and saying, your policies are creating this devastation in the healthcare sector, in the nursing community. We have to look at care work not just as caring for the self or the individual, but care work as work that reduces the hidden injuries of class and tries to heal them. So when a hospital worker goes into a particular community devastated by austerity and racism, she is trying to heal the past injuries of austerity policies in this community, and we should see it as such, not just as care for individuals. So the fight over hospitals, schools, clean water are then ultimately anti-capitalist struggles. They challenge the logic of the system that tries to dominate our lives. We can thus see why women-led struggles have actually erupted globally against austerity. And here I think I want to go back to kind of talking, ending with talking about where we go forward from here and how that is relevant to our moment of the pandemic. Because the pandemic has revealed to the world now how working people in a crisis will respond. And one of those responses is a political response against austerity measures, both past and present. But another response is how people have create strategies for survival. For most, the pandemic has meant relying on immediate friends and family. So this is a different kind of a definition or expression of care that we saw emerge during the pandemic. Some, however, are managing through mutual aid initiatives. For the homeless and those capitalist society has rejected as a burden, support has often come from heroic initiatives of social reproduction volunteers who are defying curfews and lockdowns to offer to others nothing less than the right to life. Neighborhoods across the US and the UK created WhatsApp groups to stay in touch with the most vulnerable and help them obtain food and medication. Schools sent food vouchers to poor families with children eligible for free meals. Food banks and charities saw a number of volunteers increase, people coming out to help out. So what we can see arising is nothing less than a social reproduction commons. And this social reproduction commons is arising as an urgent necessity. But we have also learned the lessons of the past. We should not allow our governments to use this social reproduction commons as an excuse for the state's withdrawal from responsibility. We have seen how empathy and love in communities have come forward to breach the gaps where state funding left, the gaping holes that state funding and state responsibilities left, but they shouldn't have to. I think as feminists, we need to push this further, to work together to call for public provision of all that is necessary for human life to thrive. This means building solidarity across the different communities that are unequally affected and resourced. This means supporting the most marginalized and arguing for those with any social resources, such as trade unions or NGOs or feminist groups, to actually pull this struggle forward. So I want to go back finally to where we see, sorry, I know you can't, I need to share this screen here again, sorry. There we go. So we need to talk about the beginnings of an insurrectionary feminism, because there is no reason, rightly, many social scientists have talked about logistics being a choke point of capitalist accumulation, that logistics workers have more power than others to stop the flow of goods, to stop accumulation. So logistics strikes can be more powerful than other kinds of strikes. But there is no reason to exclude schools or hospitals as key strategic sectors with the potential to disrupt capitalism. While sexism is definitely a tool in the neoliberal toolbox for wages and benefit cuts, we also saw through the pandemic and before care sector workplaces as becoming sites to share scripts of resistance, where nurses and teachers and communities come together to first to set up networks of mutual aid, but then to discuss why such a network is necessary and what austerity has done to their neighborhoods or workplaces. This new wave of struggle blurs what I consider an unhelpful division between class struggle and feminist struggle. I think we are very much at the point where we can call this class struggle feminism. While many of these protests can be about better wages or anti-privatization, they must be seen not only as such, but seen in their inner essence, as movements against neoliberal rapacity and for restoring care to working class lives. Politics of life and life making will always rub against profit making. for it will require the reduction of working hours and reduction of the military and carceral functions of the state in favor of social provisioning one. And in order to give the politics of life a primacy, what we need desperately is solidarity through movements, within movements, and within international boundaries. So that is the basis of an insurrectionary feminism and a feminist international that we must think about too as we move forward from this crisis. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Tithi. That was incredibly powerful, and so much to digest in there. I've got some questions of my own, but I see there's already 2 questions in the chat, so I'm going to go to the chat first, or go to the Q&A first. I'd like to remind viewers, if you want to post a question, if you can post it in the Q&A box rather than the chat box, it's easier for me to find it. So the first question from Magdalena Condas is, she says, hello, I'm really happy that I can be here. I have a question to Tithi. How would you assess the rise of social entrepreneurship as a panacea for community problems and the response to withdrawal of state/public institutions from social services provision?
If you mean NGOs and non-government services, you know, I work very closely with Indian feminists and trade unionists and Bangladeshi trade unionists and feminists. And Bangladesh has the highest number of NGOs in most, that, you know, in one of the highest number of NGOs in the world. And the I always think about it this way. In a region where there are no schools and no hospitals, and the government has provided no institutions for care work and the processes of life making, and an NGO comes and sets up a school, I am not going to be the one standing there in front of the school with a protest banner saying that the school should not be erected here because it's a private service. However, I think we also, so I think it's good that the school is being set up and definitely needs our support. But I think especially in the global South, where NGOs are most dominant, I think what happens is while it is providing these sort of essential life-making services to people on the ground, it also has 2 problems that as I see it. One is that NGOs are not accountable the way governments can be, right? So this is entirely, the private sector works entirely on the logic of its own donors and funders, and not, this is not your tax dollars that are going to determine the infrastructure of care. So there is a problem of political accountability that exists there. Secondly, it is not that you know, the government is not raising taxes in these regions, but government taxes are being used for non-life-making activities such as carceral functions and war and various other projects, most planet ruining projects often. So it's not that the taxes are not being collected, it's simply that it's not going towards institutions. So there remains the sort of second problem. And the third problem, I think, I did say 2, but I have 3. The third problem, I think, is that it creates a logic of charity that I think we should absolutely question. That this is, as I call, a right to life, right? So the access to food, access to housing, access to clean and free water and air are the rights that every person living on this planet has a right to. But when we depend on NGOs and private groups to provide this infrastructure of care, we sort of slide into a logic of charity, which really we need to question. Instead, we should, I mean, as I said, I'm not going to be the one protesting the establishment of a school, but I think I am going to, in that region, then demand from my government as to why that money is not being spent in establishing a school where, you know, Bill Gates has to come in and start a school.
Thank you. Just a kind of related question to that, or a follow-up from that, which came up in the chat in the session earlier this morning about the need to distinguish between kind of community-based organizations, which are kind of grassroots communities coming together in order to deal with a particular problem, and more the kind of international NGO approach, and that how would you distinguish between those two? Because although they're all lumped together under the kind of NGO civil society banner, actually they seem to be fulfilling different functions. And the second question, and this is, I guess, a particular issue in the UK, where you have civil society organisations providing services, but with public funding. So there is a part of the contracting out pattern is not just contracting out to the private sector, but contracting out to the voluntary sector. And it would be interesting to hear you say something about that.
So I think with the community, I think we should absolutely distinguish between community-led projects and, you know, sort of the Bill and Melinda Gates led projects, right? So, I mean, that's absolutely, definitely a difference. And I think it's fantastic when that kind of work is done at a grassroots level. My only I guess my worry would be whether that sort of work is sustainable in the long term, right? So, you know, what kind of resource, as we all know, incredible amounts of resources are needed to sustain such projects, you know, and so if these are entirely community and grassroots based, how sustainable they are at that level, and how generalizable are they, right? So that's the second question that I always have. Can we generalize this model? Let's say it works really well in Cochabamba, which, you know, one of the school projects in Cochabamba, to my knowledge, worked wonderfully, precisely doing this kind of work that you mentioned, but can we then duplicate it across you know, borders and communities? And that's where we run up against all of these barriers. And so again, we fall back upon structures where we need to demand from our states and governments that they do invest money such that such projects can become sustainable and generalizable, right? So I constantly come back to the question of states and their accountability, because we've so much in the 40 years, you know, essentially since I've been alive, it's been that states have completely withdrawn from this activity. And, you know, at this in the 80s and 90s, there was this argument being made that this means that the state has lessened in import, and it's markets that are most important right now. And I always thought that people who made that argument has never had to cross an international border, had never had to, you know, stand in humiliating queues for visas to get into countries of the global north, or been incarcerated, right? So what we saw was that the carceral powers of the state actually increased during the period of neoliberalism, precisely because the state withdrew in a way from its infrastructural care activities. So it wasn't that the state withdrew, it was that the state kind of changed its function, I would say, through the period of neoliberalism. And I think it is time for us to demand that the state at least perform those activities which as opposed to its borders and policing functions.
Thank you. We've got quite a few more questions coming in, so I'm not going to abuse my position as chair anymore by asking anything for myself. So the next question is from Ella Fegitz. I hope I pronounced that name correctly. If we include male-dominated low-paid work such as rubbish collectors and bus drivers in reproductive work, do we need to reframe how we understand the relationship between gender and reproductive labour?
That's a great question. Sorry, was it Ella?
Ella, yes.
Okay, thank you, Ella, for that question. So this is why I emphasize life-making activity rather than simply gendered care work, right? Because because social reproduction theory, or at least the way I understand social reproduction theory and write about it, does talk about unpaid labor in the home, and that is mostly, as we know, still mostly performed by women and gender non-conforming people. But social reproduction work is not simply the work within the home, right? Social reproduction work is also work outside of the home in these nodes and infrastructures that uphold and maintain life, okay? So I would absolutely include transportation, public service, and public transport systems, and garbage disposal as part of the social reproduction labor. How do we understand that in terms of gender? You know, well, it may not be particularly gendered, that work, but it is still care work, and it is also, because it's care work, it's deeply devalued. So for instance, in India, a lot of the garbage disposal work is relegated to Dalit communities, okay, so lower caste communities, and some of it is still done manual scavenging, which is about the most brutal kind of work that we can imagine. So there is still that sort of mantle of oppression and devaluation on care work, even when done by men, and it's severely racialized and in the case and slotted under ethnocentric and casteist paradigms.
Thank you. The next question is, so it's from an anonymous attendee. How can we use sectors such as care work as spaces of resistance and at the same time act to transform the unequal sexual division of labour?
Okay, thank you. This we have already seen happening, actually. I mean, if you look at the kind of strikes and social movements that have erupted in this world in the last 10 years, they have all been in the so-called care sector, or in what I would call sections of life-making activities. So for instance, we've seen a wave of teachers and nurses strikes, and I'm not just talking about the global north. We've seen teachers strikes across Tunisia, across North Africa, India, several parts of Asia, and so on, and similar to nurses strikes. We've seen women's strike, the international women's strike movement erupt since 2017, and we've seen feminist struggles such as against femicide, gender violence and femicide erupt all across Latin America, led by Argentinian feminists from the 2016 round of struggles. We're now looking at Poland, where the government had to actually take a step back from their abortion, their draconian abortion law that they just tried to pass, and we saw women explode in protests across the streets of Poland. So this is in a way why my comrades and I wrote the book Feminism for the 99%. The book was not a guide to action. It actually emerged from the action. We were trying to understand in the book why it is that in the last 10 years we have seen such an explosion of feminist struggle and what it means. And one of the conclusions we draw in the book is that liberal feminism feminism that argues that empowerment for women, the path to empowerment is a few women, a few privileged women finding their niche in capitalist management jobs is truly what empowers women. Whereas we saw the explosion of movements, which was, if you like, feminism for the many, where they were rejecting that model of feminism and talking about an insurrectionary feminism from below, or what we call a feminism for the 99%, where they were not wanting to break the glass ceiling for the few, but they were questioning the very idea of why a few women get to break the glass ceiling while all their sisters of color are down in the basement cleaning up the glass.
Thank you. The next question actually talks specifically about feminism for the 99% and the issue of gender-based violence. It's from Sally. In the pandemic, the rates of gender-based violence in the UK have increased massively. How do you explain this?
Hi, Sally. Thank you for asking that question. That was actually part of my talk, but I didn't want to go over time. So I'm really grateful you asked that. So I think it's not just the UK. I've been part of these sort of discussions now with feminists in various countries, and gender-based violence was something we were tracking and discussing, and gender-based violence absolutely increased across the board globally. And so one easy answer to that was the lockdown, right? So for the first, so you were by law and by necessity locked into the same home space with your abuser, with your oppressor, or whatever, and there was no way to get out. And the second, of course, is the economic backing to that kind of context, which is this recession that is unfolding and will unfortunately unfold even further, has been called by some as a she-cession, right? So more women, at least in the United States, have lost jobs, and women are losing jobs across the board globally in this period of economic crisis. And I think one of the things that we have to understand is that when women lose their jobs, they lose their ability to actually leave the home or leave a partner, an intimate partner who might have been violent. So it is no surprise then, and it's a matter of grave concern and worry for all of us that the lockdown, which we needed, created the conditions further of increased domestic violence for women and gender non-conforming people and children. And so I think what we're going to see in the coming days is money cut from domestic violence shelters, money funding withdrawn from resources that women need to get out of these situations. We're going to see job losses. So I think it is our job in the coming days to connect these threads and make an argument for more money to help women leave violent situations rather than keep them in it.
Thank you. Next question is from Susan Himwhite. Why are essential workers so badly paid and treated, i.e. worse than the average worker, which I think is true in most economies? You say life work is devalued and its products not seen as important, but how does this actually result in the lower wages, worse working conditions and more insecurity that essential workers typically suffer?
Okay, that's a very long question about history, so I'll just answer it very shorthand, and and I apologize for a very shorthand answer. But I mean, historically, this is the result of labor market competition and the using of race and gender to actually divide the workforce, right? So race and gender have typically been very useful tools in the labor market to actually distribute resources and to keep all wages down, but particularly depress the wages for women and people of color. And this is true globally. And so I think it is because most of this work is considered women's work per se, that these sort of sexist tropes can be easily attached to this kind of work. So I'll give you an example of teaching in the US. I've written about this before. Teaching in the 19th century, teachers were actually men and were quite well paid in the United States, because if you look at how the teaching profession evolved, you'll see that the first teachers in the 19th century were mostly white men. And teaching was not a bad job, and it was fairly well paid. But as more and more women came into the teaching profession, and men began to leave it, the remuneration for teachers changed dramatically. And so again, and then suddenly, and by the time we come to the 1960s and 70s, after the civil rights movement, where people of color began to get jobs in public sectors, this was exacerbated. This process was exacerbated further. So the short answer will be to use race and gender to keep a divided workforce.
Thank you. The next question is from Diana Teggy or Teggy. I work on social care for older people in the UK, and I was wondering in what sense, from a Marxist feminist standpoint, care work with older and often dying people is reproductive work, since it's not reproducing the waged worker and not very long lives either.
First of all, thank you for the work that you do. And it is your work that is actually leading us beyond the pandemic, because this is incredibly important that you care for our elders. Having said that, I think the way I define social reproduction theory is not just the production of life and life making, although it's a shorthand for it, but it is also crucially for the maintenance of life, right? So, it is, this is the kind of work that we need beyond the expectation of the wage. We should not be doing this work simply because, it will create the perfect wage worker, and we don't. Nobody in the care sector, when they're teaching in a school or nursing a patient, do that so that they can be hale and hearty and go back to work. People do this work because it's a human condition to care and solidarize with someone who needs that care. And so I think maintenance of life, similar to creating of life, is as important and equally vital to the functioning of a social whole.
Thank you very much. Okay, we've got another question from an anonymous attendee. On a political level, do you think social reproduction should be understood as a site of value production? If not, could you say why?
Okay, this is a very, very Marxist question, I guess. Because we're talking, when you say value production, you mean the production of exchange value, not value in the sense that something is valuable. So I don't believe domestic labor creates exchange value, although it is very valuable work and creates use values, but it doesn't create exchange value because family, which is the site of domestic labor, families as production units cannot be equalized across, across the units, right? So you cannot have that, Marianne takes 10 minutes to change diapers, and Tithi takes 5 minutes to change diapers. So we should all move diaper change to 5 minutes. You cannot establish that kind of a generalizable equalization across the units as you can for widgets, right? So if Mary Ann's company is producing widgets, let's say corkscrews in 10 minutes, and my company boss is producing corkscrew in 5 minutes, then eventually the industry standard will force Marianne's boss to go out of business, or to force Marianne's boss to make corkscrews in 5 minutes. But that is not possible across families as production sites. And so I do not believe domestic labor can produce exchange value, although I insist that domestic labor and unwaged care work is the basis for the production of all kinds of work, and hence also of exchange value.
Thank you. This next question is from Claire Walsh. Isn't it the case that whilst there was a change in the 1970s, the period when there was government support for the reproductive institutions required by working class people, you mentioned health and education, was very brief but also very limited, so the supported period was the exception? I ask because I think it has implications for how and to what extent we can disrupt this undoubtedly neoliberal tide we're experiencing, because it's really a return to type and emphasizes the institutionalized nature of a global attitude of laissez-faire.
Was the post-war period an exception? Yes, I agree with that. I think it was an exceptional period of capitalist boom, which allowed for certain welfare infrastructures to be put in place. And we also know that in the case of the United States, for instance, how inadequate those infrastructures were. So for instance, how racist the New Deal was not to include domestic workers and agricultural workers, simply because they, the vast majority of those workers were African-American people in the US. So we know the limitations of that, and we also know it's an exception, but we have to talk about the project of a state-supported free healthcare and free education for all. Now, we can only achieve so much under the capitalist state. The capitalist state will be moved only so far to do that, but I think it is our job to try.
Thank you very much. One last question, and I apologize to those people who didn't get their questions asked. We had quite a lot, and they're all quite dense questions that can't be answered in one word, in short sentences. In terms of broadening our political and social imagination, what strategies do you think are the most useful right now? Are there any historical analogies you find useful, or should we focus more on future-oriented tactics, such as social reproduction science fiction narratives?
I think social reproduction science fiction narratives will be brilliant. I've been reading Octavia Butler, and I think, we have a lot to learn from science fiction. But I think we don't have to invent the wheel in these cases. I think there are some marvelous instances globally of sort of what I call class struggle feminism, right? So we have some marvelous instances of women, people of color, forcing states to change policies. In fact, I think all laws and infrastructure that exist, that cares for life and that helps maintain life, those are all consequences of social action rather than, sort of the infrastructure existing a priori. So most of the progressive laws we see and we live under are consequences of social movements and social action by ordinary people and grassroots. I think in terms of moving forward, and I can only speak for, in a very limited way, if you like. One is, I think we should absolutely demand that unions take up the issues of race and gender. I think unions are a very, very powerful institution in many parts of the world. And unfortunately, it also in many parts of the world, trade unions are, they often limit their power by limiting their political project to simply wages and benefits when they could do so much more. In the UK, for instance, in the past, the commitment of unions to fight for abortion rights have been so fantastic in terms of furthering that struggle. In the United States right now, what we desperately need is for people to join unions. You know, the rate of unionization in this country is abysmal, but we also need unions to fight for things like Black Lives Matter, you know? So we need build bridges of solidarity between existing tools of struggle, such as trade unions and community groups, and the more community-based organizations such as feminist groups and anti-racist groups. So that unity is vital in today's world.
Thank you very much. And thank you for what's been a really powerful and inspiring end to a fabulous day. There's been so many different discussions, so many different points raised. I'm really looking forward to going back and re-watching actually some of the panels, because at the time, you know, you can't take in everything that everybody is saying. I wanted to thank you very, very much for taking the time to join us today. The downside of doing these things remotely is that we don't get to grab you and take you off to dinner and carry on this conversation for the rest of it. The upside, of course, is that we can actually have speakers from around the world without having to raise the money to pay to fly them over. So, you know, that's a good thing. But I really hope that this can be, you know, the start of a dialogue. We've already had conversations about how we can work together, and that we continue to do that. I'd like to thank everybody who's taken part in today, all the speakers and all the attendees. And I'm going to hand over to Anna Johnston, who coordinates the Early Career Network, for the last word. But before I do that, I wanted to say a really big thank you to Anna, who has organised today and has organised it brilliantly and smoothly. Everybody, all the speakers have commented to me about how well briefed they felt they were, how well organised it was. These sorts of things take place in the background and people don't notice them. It's another form of kind of reproductive labour in a way, isn't it? It's that sort of organising work that people don't see. You only notice it when it doesn't happen. But Anna has done it brilliantly. So thank you very much, Anna. And over to you for the final word.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Marianne. And thank you very much to Tithi for a fantastic, very thought-provoking keynote and such a fitting end to a fantastic day. As we bring the day to a close, I would like to extend a huge thank you to all of our speakers and our chairs, and also to Hannah, who's been also working diligently behind the scenes doing the tech and has done a fantastic job for it. I also wanted to say finally a huge thank you to all the participants for joining us today and for your excellent questions and contributions. So you can keep up with our ongoing work by joining the Early Career Network via the Women's Budget Group website and by following us on Twitter. We have a number of exciting things coming up in 2021, including our ECN book club, the WISE Working Paper Series and partnership that I mentioned earlier today, and a big event coming up in the spring, so watch this space. Yeah, so thank you everyone. We'll look forward to seeing you at another ECN event in the near future. Thank you all very much for coming. Bye everybody. Have a nice evening.
Thank you. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you.